how to understand problems of identity politics, particularly as it relates to both race and gender. It could be age as well. You know, part of it would be, I think we need to be careful about navigating between two kinds of errors. And, these are talked about a lot in social science in the terms type 1 error and type 2 error. But, the logic of what people are talking about with this, it applies to all kinds of subject position and identity politics concerns. And so the type 1 error is when you say that the two people are basically different when they're not. So to claim meaningful, significant differences between two people or between a group of people and another group of people, when there really is no meaningful, significant difference, that's a type of error. But there's another kind of error, and this is the error, type 2 error, where you say there is no difference when there actually is. See, sometimes there are meaningful and important distinctions, and people say, well, there's really no distinction at all. And so then the task is, how does one navigate between type 1 and type 2 error? Where are the places in the situations where one is more likely to commit type 1 or type 2 error? And then how sensitive can one be to, I guess, the fact that some of the arguments are hinging upon whether or not someone's committing one or the other error. Okay, so that's in the backdrop. We need to realize that there are type 1 and type 2 error problems as people talk about identity. Now, let's get at the subject position and the identity politics problem. I did work on this many, many years ago. Valerie Peterson and I did an essay. It was a sort of like a research report on subject position. And the way I want to shake it out is that there are three different dimensions, and they're ways of characterizing what one means by a subject position and how it shakes out. So, and when I say how it shakes out, I mean how it's used rhetorically in discussion, in debate, in political platforms where people are arguing for or against certain positions. Now, so there's, first off, you want to get at the subject position itself. One would be structural, the other would be existential. And when I say structural, I mean it's the kind of identity that someone occupies because of a categorical fact of the matter. That is, there is some categorical structural element that is bearing in and registering this person's identity. Now, that's very different than an existential position where one speaks out of personal experience. Now, the classic example here of the difference would be, if you say someone is a plumber, or if you say that someone is a mother, that those are structural subject positions. But if you say that person is my plumber, if you say that person is my mother, now you're moving toward a more of an existential position. This even becomes more apparent when you take someone who has been, for example, a biracial adoption, where someone looks to be of a certain ethnicity or a certain race, but existentially they've grown up in a completely different environment. That is, their parents, their friends, everyone else comes from a different structural position than that person. So now this bears into this next set. That is, subject positions, they're not just there, they need to be brought into the discursive realm in some way, and they can be brought in two different ways. One is self-asserted and the other is other-attributed. That is, sometimes people will assert their subject position. They will say, well, as an X, I can claim blah, blah, blah. And it will be something like, oftentimes a person will identify themselves as having either a structural or an existential subject position, and then they will self-assert that position. Now, there are other cases where it's other-attributed. The person is just there, and then in the interaction, someone else will call out a subject position that someone is occupying in order to either suggest that that's the reason why someone is claiming that the subject position is having a factor, or that that's what's motivating it, or in some way they'll try to either give the person a privilege because of that, or they'll try to disqualify the person because of that. And so that, you can see, leads into this third distinction, is between using subject position for epistemic privilege or for epistemic qualification. That is, sometimes one will say, look, we both see things differently, and because your subject position is, not what mine is or not what another person's is, yours isn't as legitimate as another person's. And then they'll say, well, this person has a privilege, and they see things in a privileged way. I mean, sometimes, outsider and standpoint epistemology makes some of these moves, but then it's interesting, you want to go, well, is it an existential position, or is it a structural position that's giving this epistemic privilege? That is, the further one gets from the center, the more one supposedly has an epistemic privilege within standpoint epistemology. Now, other people will say, no, it's really just about qualification. And so they will suggest that when one employs a subject position, particularly a self-asserted or another attributed, that it could just be the person's trying to say, look, this is how it looks from your view, but from my view, it appears very differently. And they're trying to qualify and give equal legitimacy to different views. That is, rather than saying one view is better than another, it's sort of like the position of the person on the defensive, and they're going, look, mine is at least as legitimate, or yours is at least needing to be qualified. That is, it's not the privileging that you're suggesting. Again, quickly reviewed there, you have two different kinds of subject position, structural and existential, and those get used for either privilege or qualification, and they're employed either in a self-asserted way or another attributed way. Now, I think part of the difficulty in all of this is that it's so easy to oversimplify things, partly because people talk about populations, and populations are interesting. We can make certain assessments about distributions of populations of people in general, and some of that can make sense. But when you move to existing individuals, particular individuals, individuals, and this, part of the study of individual differences within psychology, I mean, it's a whole field. I guess it sort of shakes out in industrial organizational psychology when people do personality inventories. I mean, largely people who work in human resources, they need to deal with individuals rather than with larger populations. So it's this whole assortment of largely, I guess, IQ tests, personality inventories, different ways to assess the type. And so it bears, I guess it sort of brings together both the sort of existential questions about what are the what was the upbringing, what are all the particular situational elements that factor into what makes this person who they are, but it also includes some of those, I guess, psychological categories that get employed about whether or not someone is a type A or type B person and all this kind of stuff. And I think part of the way to pit the problem is that people are always more than and other than any subject position that could be either self-asserted or other attributed. There's a kind of overflowing. Now, I think from my own perspective, one of the people who has really dealt with some of these issues the most successfully, the most robustly, is Jean-Paul Sartre, right? And Sartre's notion of bad faith. And the book that I would want to give a shout out of somebody who's done really great work on race relations in relationship to a particular kind of racism, anti-black racism, but this is a Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism by Lewis Gordon. And let me see if I don't know if I can do justice to Gordon's book here, but I'll see if I can say some things about what Sartre means by bad faith, and then hopefully you can see how this relates to race and gender, and also to, I guess, the value of some of the claims of understanding how to get out of bad faith, at least, I guess, to the extent that one can. You try to move toward a good faith. Okay, so when we're talking about bad faith it's not just an occasional moment in a person's life. It has to do with the problem of being self-understanding organisms that We don't just look at others and they look at us, but we are caught in dynamics of self-other, where our own sense of self, that is our own sense of self-relation, of who we think we are, is partly a product, and it's co-negotiated with who we think others think we are. And this is an ongoing dialectic. It's an ongoing, it's an event of praxis as the person becomes who they are in dialogue and interaction with other people. But it creates for very, troubling dynamics, because oftentimes it's people oversimplify the problems that are involved in things like race relations or in gender relations. They act as if all of the difficulties are over against, as if someone imposing power upon another, whereas many of them may come from a kind of self-understanding. So before I get into the Sartre example here of what he means by bad faith and some of the species of it, one way to think about it is just when the topic of white privilege comes up. I think it's always interesting. You hear this topic, somebody says, well, there's a bunch of white privilege, and then people deny it. And you'll see this, and this comes in they'll try to give a qualification, or they'll try to give a privilege they'll try to give an example of where it is happening, or they'll try to say, no, that's not right, and they'll try to qualify it in various ways, and they'll ask about whether or not the person, was it self-asserted or other attributed, and all this kind of, again, these are the categories that are operating. But it's interesting, because when people get upset and they say, no, there is no such thing as white privilege, and they want to almost say, look, I've worked very hard to get where I've gotten, and none of it has been a gift to me, and I have lots of friends who also are in this category, and they haven't experienced any benefits, blah, blah, and they're doing this kind of argument. What's interesting is that in some way it looks as if they're making a sociological claim about some fact of the matter, but it's really just as much, maybe more so, them struggling with their own self-understanding. That is, they don't want to think about themselves in that way. And so it is, in one way, it's a denial of an empirical claim of a sociological fact in a given society, but it's also an existential crisis of an organism who has to live with itself and its understanding of itself. Not just how other people think about it, but how it comes to think of itself given that. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I think if people could realize that, if they could begin with that and say, wow, there really is a sense in which some of the defensiveness about white privilege is the more interesting aspect of it, I think they could understand some of the problems of racism. That racism is not simply something that people do to one another. That racism can come to infect one from the inside out without realizing it. And so, bad faith it's a whole way of living for some people in their self-understanding. They come to think about themselves in thingly ways rather than in historically existential ways. And even there, we want to be careful not to deny the facticity of who we are and who we've become and how we're situated socio-historically, maybe even evolutionarily. Right? It gets very complicated. But so let's get to Sartre and Bad Faith. So by bad faith, Sartre talks about this capacity of a person, or maybe even a whole society, to submit to two kinds of trends in thought. One would be a sadistic trend, one would be a masochistic trend. Now, hopefully you can see the relation of this to both race relations and gender relations. I'll see if I can do some gender stuff here as we're proceeding along. But so when he talks about sadistic bad faith and masochistic bad faith, let's get at those first. So I think this is sometimes when you hear the feminist arguments about the actor versus the object, this sort of objectification versus the subjective actor. And it's overstated, because I don't think that it makes any sense, and Sartre certainly would not agree, to say that men are the actor and women are the acted upon. The point is that both men and women, whites and other races, I mean, you can get at all these different racial dynamics, minority groups and majority groups, that would maybe be an easier way to come at it, but each one will have a tendency to slide toward sadistic tendencies or masochistic tendencies. Now, the sadist is the unlooked at looker. It's the person who sees without feeling themselves seen. It's the person who largely takes themselves to be the actor but not an object in the world. That is, they experience their transcendence but have a tendency to deny their facticity. And so you can imagine like the overweight, not too good looking guy who's sitting on the beach, like thinking to himself, oh, that woman is hot, this woman isn't, this woman is hot. And he's sort of there evaluating other women on some beauty scale, even though he's never thought to bring that scale to himself. This is a sadistic tendency. The person who imagines that everyone else is an object for them to consider, but themselves as an object in the world for others, doesn't really appear and register to the sadist. Again, in the sadistic it's a tendency that we all have, and we can talk about those places and moments where we're more sadistic or masochistic. Now, the masochist is roughly, right, it's the person who is the unlooking looked at. It's the seen without seeing. It's the person who is wholly an object before the other and yet denies their right, capacity, or privilege to look back. In some way, this is a person who denies their transcendence and focuses upon their facticity. Now, there's so many different ways to shake this out. Now, in general, men tend to be more sadistic and women tend to be more masochistic, at least in this culture. We could also deal with things like, take something like a thief. Okay, let's take thief as an example. Now, the person who says to themselves, they say, look, you know, okay, I've taken a couple of things from work, or I've done a couple of, you know, I've stolen a couple of things now and then, you know, the particular places where it was convenient and everyone sort of understood that people do that, but I'm not a thief. That's a person being sadistic. The other person could take that exact same set of behavior and go, you know, I stole those things, I took them, and I know even if other people knew that I was going to, I took them in, and I know that I shouldn't have, and therefore I'm a thief. I'm nothing but a thief. And those are the tendencies, right? A person can come to think of themselves as so coagulated with history, with past, with their past situation, that they reduce themselves and they say, I'm nothing more than what I've been. Or I'm nothing more than what I appear to be to others. There are other people who are so focused on their own self-definition and maybe on their own future, on their own prerogative to define, that they'll say, look, my past doesn't define me. I'm still an open project, and it's what I'm choosing to do and how I understand myself that really matters, not what other people think. Now, see, I think the more that people could try to understand the subject position, the whole identity politics debate, sort of see these larger problems in terms of bad faith, and that people are going to need to move toward a good faith. Well, what's a good faith? Well, good faith is realizing that one always has both facticity and transcendence. That is, the existing individual, the actual person, has both facticity and transcendence. That is, they are an object in the world for others, and they do have certain characteristics, and those, with humility and courage and acceptance, they need to be recognized. But one needs to also move toward an understanding and an appreciation of the degree to which one has transcendence, that one is more than one has been. One can grow and can cultivate oneself. And I think it's, if you say, look, I'm open to unrelented self-fashioning, that's sadistic. But if you go, look, I just can't change, that's masochistic. The problem is, how does one learn to navigate between two kinds of errors? Look, people are different from one another, but people aren't as different as they sometimes suggest, but people are sometimes more different than they're suggesting. Wisdom is learning how to appreciate those differences and to understand where people are making the certain kinds of errors as they're having these discussions. I think without people being willing to be humble and vulnerable to each other and ask the problem of how much of this is socio-political power that's exerted over against people versus how much of this is a problem that comes to infect people in their self-understanding, maybe that would open, that would open the discussion in some useful or hopefully more directed ways. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.